Bruno Mars had the entire stadium singing at the top of their lungs as the opening chords of Risk It All echoed through the night. More than 55,000 foam lights swayed like stars beneath the stage while giant LED screens followed his every move. He smiled, pointed the microphone toward the crowd, and let them carry the first chorus. It was supposed to be one of the most unforgettable moments of the concert. Then, halfway through the second verse, something unexpected happened. Bruno's eyes suddenly shifted away from the front rows. For just a split second, his smile disappeared. He missed a lyric. The band kept playing, the dancers stayed perfectly on beat, and most of the audience didn't notice anything unusual. But the camera caught it. Bruno wasn't looking at the crowd anymore. He was staring at one small section near the barricade. Nobody knew what he had seen. The giant screens zoomed closer to his face, revealing an expression fans had almost never seen before. It wasn't fear. It wasn't confusion. It was concern. Real concern. Security guards near the front suddenly began moving through the crowd, weaving between hundreds of fans who were still singing without realizing something had gone wrong. A few people pointed toward the same spot Bruno couldn't stop watching. Others lifted their phones higher, trying to figure out what was happening. The music continued, but the atmosphere had changed. The excitement was slowly being replaced by uncertainty. Bruno took 2 slow steps toward the edge of the stage, still holding the microphone, but he wasn't singing anymore. He lowered it beside his leg and watched silently as the crowd in front of him began to separate. Then he quietly asked the band to keep playing without him. The audience looked at each other in confusion. Was there a medical emergency? Had someone been injured? Or had Bruno seen something nobody else could? Seconds later, one of the spotlight operators redirected a single beam toward the front row. That's when Bruno finally saw her clearly. A young woman had collapsed to the ground, and clutched tightly in one hand was a small, folded letter with the words "Risk It All" written across the front. Bruno stood completely still. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know why she was holding that letter. But somehow, he had a feeling that this wasn't just another medical emergency. And deep inside, he knew the concert was about to become a story nobody inside that stadium would ever forget. Olivia was only 24 years old, but life had already asked more of her than most people face in a lifetime. She grew up in a small coastal town with her mother, a kindergarten teacher who always filled their tiny apartment with old records and second-hand books. Her father had passed away when she was still a child, leaving behind only a worn-out acoustic guitar that never stayed in tune. That guitar became Olivia's first connection to music. She couldn't play it well, but every Sunday evening she would sit by the window, strum the same few chords, and imagine herself standing in front of a stage where Bruno Mars was singing. It became her little escape whenever life felt too heavy. As she got older, Olivia worked long shifts at a neighborhood cafe while saving every extra dollar in an old glass jar she kept hidden inside her closet. She called it her dream jar. Every tip, every birthday gift, every bit of spare change went into it. Her co-workers laughed whenever she refused to spend the money on herself. She would just smile and say, "One day it'll be worth it." Nobody realized she had been saving for almost 5 years just to attend a Bruno Mars concert. Bruno's music had been with her through every chapter of her life. When she felt lonely, she listened to Talking to the Moon. When she celebrated small victories, 24K Magic filled her apartment. But one song was different. Risk It All wasn't just another track on a playlist. It became the soundtrack to every difficult decision she ever made. Whenever she doubted herself, she would close her eyes, put on her headphones, and whisper the lyrics before taking another step forward. It reminded her that sometimes the biggest dreams only come true when you're willing to risk everything for them. Olivia had a habit nobody knew about. Before listening to that song, she always unfolded a small handwritten letter she carried everywhere. The paper had become soft around the edges after years of being folded and unfolded. Inside wasn't a message from Bruno. It wasn't an autograph either. It was a letter she had written to herself at 19 years old, promising that no matter how difficult life became, she would never stop believing that better days were waiting. She had never shown it to anyone. Not her family. not her closest friends. Tonight, that same letter rested tightly in her hand as she stood only a few meters away from the stage. Her eyes filled with tears the moment Bruno began singing "Risk It All." Every word brought back memories she had spent years trying to bury. Her breathing became uneven. Her hands started trembling. Around her, thousands of fans were singing at the top of their lungs, completely unaware that Olivia was fighting a battle nobody could see. Then, just as the chorus reached its most emotional line, the world around her slowly faded to black. The letter slipped from her fingers, and Bruno Mars was the first person on that stage to notice. A few hours before the concert, Olivia had stood outside the stadium holding that folded letter so tightly that the edges had started to tear. Hundreds of fans were laughing, taking selfies, and buying merchandise, but she barely noticed any of it. She kept looking at the entrance, taking deep breaths as if she were trying to convince herself to walk inside. This wasn't just another concert for her. It was the ending she had been waiting years to write. The letter in her hand wasn't meant to stay with her forever. It was meant for Bruno Mars. She had rewritten it dozens of times over the past 3 years, never feeling that the words were good enough. Every version ended the same way: "Thank you for helping me survive the days I thought I couldn't." She never expected Bruno to read it. She only dreamed of leaving it somewhere backstage or handing it to a crew member. That alone would have been enough. But there was one impossible dream she had never told anyone. She wanted Bruno to hear just one sentence from her own mouth. Not a long conversation. Not a photo. Not an autograph. Just 6 simple words. "Your music saved my life, Bruno." It sounded like such a small dream, yet it felt completely impossible. Thousands of fans surrounded him every night. Security barriers stretched across the front of every stage. Meet-and-greet tickets had sold out months before she could even afford one. To everyone else, Bruno Mars was a global superstar. To Olivia, he was the voice that had pulled her through nights when she felt completely alone. She knew the chances of ever speaking to him were almost zero, but somehow she couldn't stop believing. Before leaving home that morning, her mother had hugged her at the front door and gently fixed the necklace Olivia always wore. "If you don't get to meet him," her mother whispered, "don't let that ruin tonight. You've already made it here." Olivia smiled, but she didn't answer. Deep down, she had promised herself something. If she couldn't give Bruno the letter tonight, she would never try again. This concert was her only chance. As the lights dimmed and Bruno walked onto the stage, Olivia slipped the letter into her jacket pocket and placed one hand over her heart. She whispered the same words she had repeated for years. "Please, just one chance." She had no idea that only minutes later, the song "Risk It All" would bring back every painful memory she had tried to hide. She had no idea that the letter would fall from her hand before she could ever give it away. And she had no idea that Bruno Mars himself had already noticed her standing in the crowd, long before fate brought their stories together. The chorus of "Risk It All" filled every corner of the stadium as thousands of fans sang louder than the speakers themselves. Golden lights swept across the audience, fireworks burst above the stage, and camera flashes flickered like lightning in every direction. Bruno Mars walked confidently across the runway, smiling as he pointed his microphone toward the crowd. It looked like another perfect concert. The dancers hit every mark. The band played flawlessly. Security guards remained focused on the front barricade while camera operators chased every movement Bruno made. Nobody suspected that the night was only seconds away from changing forever. Then, near the end of the chorus, Bruno instinctively looked toward the front row again. The same place that had caught his attention moments earlier. This time, he didn't see a fan singing. He saw panic. People around Olivia suddenly stepped backward, waving their arms at security. One fan dropped her phone. Another knelt beside Olivia, calling for help. The folded letter had fallen onto the floor beside her, partially opened by the movement of the crowd. Bruno stopped walking. His voice faded before the last line of the chorus. The band continued playing for a few more seconds, unsure whether he had intentionally paused or missed his cue. His in-ear monitor buzzed as the musical director asked if everything was okay, but Bruno didn't answer. He couldn't take his eyes off what was happening below the stage. Security rushed toward the barricade while medical staff pushed through the crowd carrying emergency equipment. Fans who had been screaming moments earlier were now completely silent, watching with worried expressions. The giant LED screen still showed Bruno's face, and for the first time that night, millions of people could see the concern in his eyes. He slowly lowered the microphone. The music continued underneath him, but he wasn't listening anymore. He watched as one medic gently picked up the folded letter from the ground before placing it beside Olivia. Something about that small piece of paper caught Bruno's attention. Across the front, written in dark blue ink, were the words, "For Bruno." His heartbeat quickened. He didn't know why, but he couldn't stop staring at it. The crowd waited. The band looked at Bruno, waiting for a signal. Even the dancers had stopped moving. The entire production seemed frozen in place. Then Bruno quietly raised one hand toward the band. One by one, the instruments faded until only the soft sound of the piano remained. 60,000 people stood in complete silence. Nobody knew whether the concert was ending or simply pausing. Bruno took a slow breath and stepped closer to the edge of the stage, still looking toward Olivia. He had no idea who she was. He didn't know what was inside that letter. But something deep inside told him that if he kept singing as though nothing had happened, he would regret it for the rest of his life. And in that moment, without saying a single word, Bruno Mars realized the next decision he made would matter far more than any performance he had planned that night. Bruno Mars stood at the edge of the stage, staring into the crowd while thousands of people waited for his next move. The spotlight followed him, but for once, he didn't feel like the center of attention. He felt like a person who had to make a choice. The easiest thing would have been to continue the show. The medical team was already helping Olivia. Security was handling the situation. The band could restart the song. The concert schedule could continue exactly as planned. After all, Bruno had performed through difficult moments before. He knew how to stay professional. He knew how to smile even when things were complicated. But something about this moment felt different. He looked down at the small folded letter sitting in the hands of one of the security members. The words "For Bruno" were still visible on the front. For some reason, he couldn't ignore it. He wondered who Olivia was. He wondered what she had written. Most importantly, he wondered what she had been feeling in the moments before she collapsed. Maybe it was excitement. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was something much deeper. Bruno looked back at the audience. Some fans were crying. Some were holding their hands over their mouths. Others were standing silently, waiting to see what he would do. He could feel the pressure of the moment. One wrong decision could turn a private situation into a public spectacle. He didn't want Olivia to feel embarrassed. He didn't want her most emotional moment to become just another viral clip online. For a few seconds, Bruno hesitated. He stepped away from the microphone and looked toward his team. The stage manager approached him quickly through the side entrance. "Should we continue?" the manager asked. Bruno didn't answer immediately. He looked toward Olivia again. The young woman was slowly becoming conscious while medical staff checked on her. Her eyes opened slightly, confused by the bright lights and the thousands of faces around her. Then she noticed Bruno standing there. Their eyes met for only a moment. Bruno saw something he recognized. Not excitement. Not just admiration. It was someone who had carried a story for a very long time and finally reached the moment where she couldn't hold it inside anymore. Bruno lowered his head and took a deep breath. He wasn't thinking about the cameras anymore. He wasn't thinking about the set list. He wasn't thinking about the next song. He was thinking about the person in front of him. Then he did something the production team didn't expect. He turned off his microphone. He stepped away from the center of the stage. And instead of waiting for Olivia to come to him, Bruno Mars walked down the stairs toward the crowd. The entire stadium reacted with a wave of shocked whispers. Security immediately surrounded him, but Bruno kept moving slowly. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't trying to create a dramatic moment. He was simply trying to reach a fan who had come to share something important with him. When he finally reached the barricade, Bruno looked at Olivia and gently asked, "Are you okay?" Olivia couldn't answer at first. She just stared at him, tears filling her eyes. The dream she had carried for years was standing right in front of her. But before she could say anything, Bruno noticed the letter in her hand. He looked at it carefully and asked one simple question. "Is that for me?" Olivia nodded slowly. Her hands were still shaking. She whispered, "I thought I'd never give it to you." Bruno smiled softly and replied, "I'm glad you did." And in that quiet moment, surrounded by a stadium full of people, Bruno realized this was no longer just a concert. It was a story waiting to be heard. The stadium fell into a silence that felt impossible. A few minutes earlier, the same place had been shaking with thousands of voices, but now every person was watching one moment unfold. Bruno Mars was standing at the barricade, only a few steps away from Olivia. The bright stage lights that had followed him all night now reached into the crowd, illuminating a young woman who never imagined she would be standing this close to him. Olivia looked overwhelmed. Her hands were trembling as she held the folded letter against her chest. She wanted to speak, but the words she had practiced for years suddenly disappeared. Bruno noticed. He didn't rush her. He didn't tell her to calm down. He simply waited. For a moment, the biggest superstar in the stadium stood quietly, giving one fan the space to find her voice. "Take your time," Bruno said softly. Those 3 words broke something inside Olivia. She covered her mouth, trying to stop herself from crying. "I wrote this 3 years ago," she finally whispered. Bruno leaned closer so he could hear her better. 3 years? Olivia nodded. "I never thought you'd actually see it." Bruno looked at the letter in her hands. The paper was old. The corners were damaged. Some of the ink had faded from being touched so many times. He gently asked, "Can I read it?" Olivia looked surprised. She slowly handed it to him. The stadium watched as Bruno opened the letter carefully, almost like he was holding something fragile. The cameras zoomed in, showing the handwritten words on the page. It wasn't a message asking for fame. It wasn't asking for a photo or a special favor. It was a simple thank you. Olivia had written about the nights she felt lost, the moments she thought she wasn't strong enough, and how Bruno's music gave her a reason to keep moving forward. Bruno read silently for several seconds. His expression slowly changed. The smile he usually wore on stage disappeared, replaced by something much more human. Emotion. He looked back at Olivia and asked quietly, "You really went through all of this?" Olivia nodded. "Your songs were there when nobody else was." The words hit Bruno harder than she expected. He looked down for a moment, taking a breath. Even with thousands of people watching, Bruno Mars seemed to forget about the cameras. He wasn't performing anymore. He was listening. He reached through the barricade and held Olivia's hand. "Thank you for trusting me with your story," he said. Olivia started crying again. Around them, fans in the front rows wiped their eyes. Some hugged strangers. Others lowered their phones because they realized they weren't watching a performance anymore. They were witnessing something personal. Then Bruno noticed one more thing inside the letter. A small photo had been attached to the back. It was a picture of Olivia as a teenager, sitting beside her father's old guitar. Bruno looked at the photo and asked, "Is this where it started?" Olivia smiled through her tears. "Yeah. That's when I started dreaming." Bruno looked toward the stage, then back at her. He knew there was no way to recreate this moment with lights or special effects. It was already something bigger than a concert. Then Bruno did something nobody expected. He turned around, walked back toward the stage, and reached for his microphone. The crowd thought he was going to continue the show. But instead, Bruno looked back at Olivia and said, "I think this song belongs to you tonight." The band members exchanged surprised looks as they prepared their instruments again. The piano began playing the first few notes of Risk It All. But this time, the song sounded completely different.
Bruno wasn't singing to thousands of fans.
He was singing to one person who had carried his music in her heart for years. Olivia stood there with tears streaming down her face, surrounded by thousands of people who were now singing with her. And as Bruno reached the final line, something happened that made the entire stadium realize this night was about to become even more unforgettable. The first notes of Risk It All echoed through the stadium again, but this time the atmosphere was completely different.
Nobody was screaming just to be heard. Nobody was jumping just to capture a video.
More than 55,000 people stood still, listening to every word as if the song had been written specifically for that one moment. Bruno stood under the soft white spotlight, looking toward Olivia in the crowd. She was still holding the letter close to her chest, tears falling down her face, but now there was a smile too. The same person who had collapsed minutes earlier was now standing inside the memory she had dreamed about for years. As Bruno sang the chorus, he slowly walked toward the edge of the stage again. He reached out his hand, and security carefully helped Olivia move closer to the barricade. The crowd immediately reacted with cheers, but Bruno raised his hand, asking everyone to stay quiet.
This wasn't about creating a spectacle. It was about giving Olivia a moment she would never forget. When she reached the stage, Bruno offered his hand and helped her step onto the platform. For a second, Olivia froze. She looked around at the lights, the cameras, the massive stage, and the thousands of faces watching her.
"I can't believe this," she whispered.
Bruno smiled and answered, "Neither can I."
The crowd laughed softly, but the emotion remained.
Bruno didn't want Olivia to feel like just another fan who received a lucky moment.
He wanted her to understand something.
Her story mattered. He asked her one question. "Why this song?"
Olivia looked down at the letter in her hands.
She took a deep breath and replied, "Because it reminded me not to give up." The stadium went silent again. Bruno nodded slowly. He knew those words.
He knew what it meant to keep chasing a dream when nobody else could see it yet.
Then Bruno did something unexpected.
He stepped away from the microphone and invited Olivia to stand beside him.
The band continued playing softly while Bruno said, "Tonight, we don't sing this alone." The audience immediately understood.
Thousands of voices joined together, singing the lyrics back to them. Olivia covered her face as she cried, overwhelmed by the sounds surrounding her. Bruno watched her reaction and smiled. The same song that had once helped her survive difficult moments was now being sung with her in the middle of a stadium. But the night still had one more surprise. As the final notes approached, the giant screens behind the stage suddenly changed. Instead of showing Bruno, they showed a photo of Olivia and her father with the old guitar she had mentioned in her letter. Olivia looked up in shock. She had never given that picture to anyone except Bruno. She turned toward him with confusion.
"How did you get this?" Bruno smiled but didn't answer immediately. The crowd became curious.
The band members looked at each other, knowing something bigger was coming. Then Bruno revealed that before the concert, his team had read Olivia's letter and learned about the guitar, the dream jar, and the promise she made to herself years ago. But they had discovered something else too.
Something Olivia never expected anyone to know.
Her father's old guitar was still alive. It had been repaired and brought to the stadium that night. Olivia covered her mouth as a crew member slowly walked onto the stage carrying a familiar wooden guitar. The same guitar she thought she had lost forever. The crowd gasped.
Bruno gently handed it to her.
"Some dreams deserve a second chance," he said. Olivia touched the strings with shaking hands.
For a moment, she wasn't standing beside Bruno Mars.
She was the little girl sitting by the window, dreaming about a future she couldn't imagine.
Then Bruno looked at her and asked, "Do you want to play one note?"
Olivia laughed through her tears.
"I don't know if I can." Bruno smiled. "You already did."
She placed her fingers on the strings and played one simple chord.
It wasn't perfect. It wasn't meant to be.
But inside that stadium, that single sound became louder than any fireworks or special effects. And as the crowd applauded, nobody realized that the biggest surprise of the night had not happened yet. Because the story Olivia brought to Bruno wasn't only about how his music saved her, it was about how her story was about to inspire thousands of other people watching.